Welcome home to Passionate Justice 165 for the week of 18 February 2017. I am Jonathan Wolfman. Thank you so much for being with us this week on Our Salon Radio. At Our Salon Radio, we invite you, and yes, you back there, we invite you to read with us, write with us, and of course, while you're not required to write, if you are comfier reading and commenting, I do think eventually you will want to write. You may join the Our Salon Readers and Writers community. How many? Coming on 1,200 superb writers, keen readers, personal essay, memoir, poetry, political, and social justice commentary. Where? www.oursalon.ning.com. Join us. Membership, as with all the best of life, is free. And now, Passionate Justice. And now, Passionate Justice may be heard when? Monday night, 7 p.m. Pacific on APRI, Alternative Public Radio International. And dig this. You may hear all of Our Salon's programs, each of the podcasts. Listen at your leisure. How? www.oursalon.ning.com/new episodes. One word, new episodes. And yes, I ask you to watch on Netflix the award-winning film OC-87, a brilliant personal journey, a triumph, living, overcoming mental illness, directed by Bud Clayman, a friend of our program. And now, God bless our newborn Reich. And I want to repeat my opening message to progressives. I become concerned when progressives analyze fascists' moves to a point of harm, where what matters are their takes on each separate, deliberately steamrolled insult to democracy, so that by the time they fashion pithily refined version umpteen, wasting thought energy, not subverting illegitimacy itself, in too many instances, expecting applause for it all, they look up surprised that detention wire and prison bars do not clap. And I open this week with a question to you, not about Mr. Trump, but about Mr. Putin. Is Mr. Putin this incompetent? Really? Is it not rather stunning that a man who rose to the top ranks of Soviet then Russian intelligence would be no better at, would so bungle the masterminding of a coup here? Oh, wait, squeamish, don't like the word coup? Fine, go with critically destabilize, so muck it up that it would be suspected by millions in the West well before November that it would begin wholly to unravel a month into the administration in whose success, whose longevity the coup was devised and executed. And people do not think that just because the National Security Advisor stepped in it with such a splash and is now gone, don't you dare think that we are not still living in a nascent coup. We open this week continuing Harper Magazine's 11-part series on the resistance. Here's part 5, Harper's Magazine, Libidinal Politics, by Katrina Forrester, The New American Misogyny. The history of feminism is filled with backlashes, but this one looks to be especially bad. Abortion rights are under threat from the federal government. The promised repeal of the Affordable Care Act would strip many women of health insurance and could severely restrict access to affordable contraception. Social services that help low-income women, disproportionately immigrants and women of color, of course, will likely be cut. It's hard to imagine that the gender wage gap will improve until a Trump administration is gone, and easy to imagine both a rise in sexual assault and a drop in the number of assaults reported. That glass ceiling now feels like the concern of better days. Trump has licensed and unleashed a breed of misogyny that goes far beyond the soft conservatism we're used to, with its rhetoric of mothers, wives, and daughters, of women as the property of men. A backlash signals a new reality, but of course that reality already existed. In the past decade, Republican-controlled state legislatures have forced abortion clinics across the nation to close. Women have become the fastest-growing segment of the prison population, and deportations have increased, upending the lives and livelihoods of the immigrant and undocumented women deported, as well as the many they've left behind. The working-class women of color, who constitute nearly half the low-wage female labor force, have suffered because of the coverage gap created by states that decided not to expand Medicaid. The extent of the backlash depends, of course, on where you begin. The Trump administration will require sustained opposition at every level. Organizations for women's rights excel at the politics of safety, and work is already being done by hundreds of them. Hundreds of organizations. The National Network of Abortion Funds, Women with a Vision, the Immigrant Solidarity Network, and Incite, Women, Gender, Nonconforming, and Trans People of Color Against Violence are among the many that provide crucial services, whether it's patient escorts at abortion clinics or legal advice and sanctuary for those at risk of deportation or violence. They need your time and they need your money. Yet feminist and progressive politics cannot survive on defensive strategies alone. Focusing only on safety nets, that focuses our sights too low, and it also risks handing Trump easy victories. If he controls the violence that his campaign has stirred up, by that measure at least he can claim success. A vision of a better life matters just as much. The coming years will see a new wave of local, legislative, and political battles for sick pay, childcare, and minimum wage laws, and against housing and employment discrimination. I am telling you this, people. Me. Do not think that somehow toppling Trump gets rid of these and other issues. Even in national security, Mr. Pence is every bit as detrimental to our needs as Americans, men, women, and children. All of these are feminist issues that should be fought for through unions or groups like the Working Families Party. These fights will take place in an ever harsher climate, but these fights are vital. They are also a crucial part of any strategy for winning over the women whom feminists can tend to ignore, from the working class women of color whose votes the Democrats take for granted. Yes, they did, and we know what happened, to the majority of white women who stuck with the GOP. Maybe they were used to Trump's type of vulgarity, thought they could tame it. Perhaps they liked it. I don't know. Maybe they believed that other issues were more important. The return of class concerns to national politics in the States and in Europe has thus far worked to the right's advantage. But local progressive groups are already organizing successfully across class and identity lines. It's up to us to listen to them. They know it's harder to get an abortion if you're poor, and that the working class is not composed solely of white men in old factory towns, but also includes black and brown and indigenous and white women in the care sector, the fastest growing in the economy. To take the fight to the new administration and limit the damage this administration can do, feminists must be relentless. Men and women must be relentless in showing that there is no contradiction between protecting women's rights and providing an alternative economic vision for the United States. The potential victims of Trumpism will need to be defended at every stage, but in a way that does not overstate his power or enhance his appeal. The challenge is how to accomplish it amid a backlash in which the idea of feminism itself has suffered lasting harm. Was Clinton's pantsuit feminism to blame, or was she simply the most recent in a long line of women who asked for too much? The DNC must bear some responsibility here. It weaponized representational politics, but made little long-term commitment to tackling inequality. A divorce of feminism from material concerns that has done it no favors. The pressing question is now how to confront the new politics of vengeance. The pressing question now is how we must confront the new politics of vengeance. Trump has tapped into a visceral, libidinal politics that centers on the identity of those who feel themselves to have been wronged. He promises redress, to return to his supporters what was stolen from them, to give back what they're owed. Such politics does not bode well for whoever is blamed, especially when Trump's outlandish promises are inevitably broken and his supporters betrayed. Where redress fails, retribution is often the next step. The idea put forward by Trump last March that women who have abortions might be punished signals the possibility that the retribution may well be violent. Threats like these make resistance hard. But the immediate difficulties do lie elsewhere. To protect the rights of women and everyone else, we must strike a balance. On the one hand, we should refuse to normalize white supremacy and racism, or to allow the memes of the right, like its critique of identity politics, to seep into progressivism in a way that marginalizes feminism and anti-racism. On the other hand, we've got to find a way to do this alongside this new libidinal politics. That politics, a product both of the crisis of masculinity that has accompanied economic decline and of white nationalist alt-right that drives the backlash, is complex. It is complex, and it takes every expression of liberal outrage as an opportunity. Here lies the difficulty for those committed to resisting it. Outrage at sexism, at racism, at homophobia, at transphobia, take your pick, energizes. The outrage energizes Trump's core. Just as Clinton's feminism alienated the women who voted for Trump, both Trump and the GOP will make use of this energy for an excited basis, also a distracted one. A certain kind of indignation is precisely what will keep him from having to acknowledge his larger betrayals. Too little attention to this new politics would allow it to permeate the culture. Too much would distract us. We risk overestimating the strength of Trump's base, or ignoring those within it who can be convinced that there are better alternatives. Meanwhile, the agenda to roll back not only reproductive and minority rights, but also the welfarist, regulatory, and economic capacities of the state would go unchallenged. If the fight against this particular backlash is to be successful, oh, do we need to aim high. And from Harper's Magazine, Trump a Resister's Guide, Part 6 of 11, Hymn to Harm City by Lawrence Jackson. Around the time that Ronald Reagan was elected president, my dad lost his job as the branch director of a manpower center in Baltimore. Reagan ended urban public employment programs, accelerated mass incarceration, prompted massive disinvestment in Black and Latino regions of the country, renewed the government's friendly relations with South Africa's apartheid regime, and covertly sponsored wars in Central America. His domestic war, that is, the war on drugs, produced a new and magnificently exculpatory idea for the rest of the nation: black on black violence. I was in 8th grade then, and I remember finding it odd that my public school was now considering ketchup a nutrient-rich vegetable. The actual color of the ketchup also changed from bright red to a kind of maroon, and the packages went from foil to plastic. Reagan came to office on the promise of returning America to the era of Generals Patton and MacArthur. Sound familiar? The year World War II turned in favor of the Allies. That alliance, or at least its North Atlantic members, is what people mean when they say the West: the United States, the UK, France. The most arrogant inhabitants of these nations, sadly often those who were leading, understood themselves to be the ordained directors of human beings across the globe, across space, across time. They were committed to civilization by the sword. Yet not even Reagan was mighty enough to reinstall the American militants who ached to battle the Russians and the Chinese. Reagan took to politics for what he couldn't achieve in his original profession, acting. He stood in the shadow of John Wayne, a cultural hero who embodied American ethical values and social mores, and whose work in front of the camera had deep political impact. In '72, in an interview with Life magazine, Wayne declared that the problem wasn't that the Vietnam War was folly, it was that the values of white rule weren't being exported vigorously enough. Wayne's films gave audiences a steady dose of what the historian Richard Slotkin calls regeneration through violence. Both civilization and capitalist bonanza depend on violent encounters and imperial expansion. If the country is to be healthy, it needs some frontier populated by some brand of an enemy. Donald Trump ably splits the difference between the Duke and the Kipper. He admires the strong man and instinctively maneuvers the world of the camera and the tweet in a way that makes genuine elites cringe. Trump is known for his garish splendor, which acknowledges no possibility of excess, no volume too high, no light too bright, no gilding ever enough. Trump's politics first became plain in '73, when the Department of Justice sued him and his dad for systematically preventing black people from renting units in their buildings. In '89, shortly after a jogger in Manhattan Central Park was reported to have been raped by black and Latino teens, Trump bought a full-page ad calling for the return of the death penalty. The convicted rapists were later proved to have been bullied by the police into giving false confessions. Perhaps they were also victims of salivating advertisements. Trump's apparent enthusiasm for extraordinary state force and his suggestion that the nation's legal structure needs rigorous goading to carry out deadly business is what endears him to some and, yes, makes him so terrifying to others. It is worth remembering now that in the 80s, the national government's failures with respect to employment, AIDS, public education, drug rehab, and racial justice were balanced by a groundswell of countervailing activity, not least among that was the cultural movement that came to be called Afrocentrism. Afrocentrists organized protests in response to the deaths of Eleanor Bumpurs, a New Yorker who was wrongfully killed by police, and Yusuf Hawkins, who was killed by a mob in Bensonhurst. They created PhD programs in African American studies, excavated thematic and sonic resources to create the golden age of hip hop, proposed the dynastic names that people gave their children, resurrected Malcolm X, and brought Kwanzaa cards to CVS. And the movement's forefront were unheralded scholars like John Henrik Clarke, but the milieu also fostered the success of better-known black academics like Henry Louis Gates Jr. and filmmakers such as Spike Lee. Afrocentric bonhomie served up leather craftwork medallions as an answer to jewelry made from South African mined gold, and laid terra firma between professional community organizers like Barack Obama and the people in hard places like Chicago's South Side that those organizers sought to mobilize. The robust opposition to Reagan's dawn had 19th century precedent in Baltimore, where I still live, a town that Trump likes to insert as a refrain in his litany of municipal heretics that he intends to convert to the true religion by way of the Third Army or the Seventh Fleet. In Baltimore's history, we can actually glimpse a more wonderful future. Recall our homeboy, Frederick Douglass. Douglass was a dreamer and a brooder, and for the most part had a hard time connecting with other black people. But in Baltimore, he learned the skills he needed to escape slavery. The ideals of collective mobilization that thrived during Douglass's tenure in Charm City, in institutions such as the Sharp Street United Methodist Church, where there was an antebellum school, and the East Baltimore Mental Improvement Society, which gave him an early opportunity for debate, have rooted there with some force. They're here. Almost 200 years later, the same soil is nourishing a legislative reform group called Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, founded by a group of inner-city debaters who wanted to work inside poor black communities. Leaders of Beautiful Struggle, LBS, figured out the kinds of policing reforms that were desired, built the coalitions necessary to create legislation, and started backing the progressive politicians willing to charge ahead. After the death of Freddie Gray, oh, I know you remember, people, the death of Freddie Gray, dragged and bumped around for how many hours in back of a police van, arrested for, of course, breathing while black. They took the lead in organizing marches and protests at City Hall. A new generation of Baltimore intellectuals, activist writers, college professors draws its members from Morgan State University's Public Health Department and the Africana Studies Department at Johns Hopkins. New coalitions, including Equity Matters, a nonprofit emphasizing the relationship between poverty and poor health, and the Right to Housing Alliance, have spoken out against a corporate profit-driven, implicitly racist program to redesign the southern part of that city's waterfront as a hygienic white space. The Liberation Institute, a debate camp named after Eddie Conway, a Black Panther who was incarcerated for more than 40 years, emphasizes black cultural identity and social justice, and helps to rear articulate leaders who will not knuckle under, out for justice. No, not that Steven Seagal film. Out for Justice, an organization of ex-offenders, counsels parolees on the expungement of their records and how to invest as citizens in the communities that need them. Even the federal government plays a part with the youth mentorship program My Brother's Keeper. And then there are the black businesses on 25th Street in Baltimore and the bookstore at Everyone's Place. All this is to say that when Trump's legions rise from their podiums in Philadelphia, Mississippi, and wave banners emblazoned with welfare creams, we will meet them in the field. Our response will be direct, and it will be sufficient, and we will win. Now, our friend Claire Connor, among the bravest people I know, who broke with her parents for good as a teen in the 1960s, as they were among the founders of the radical right John Birch Society, here is her new piece. Trump and the radical right control the U.S. now. Who will resist? The moment Donald Trump descended from his gilded tower and anointed himself the savior of the United States, I worried. While the press, the Democrats, and most Republicans had a good laugh, I read right-wing websites. I knew Trump had a rabid following. While the left laughed, Trump took over the radical right and the Republican Party. I knew we were in serious trouble when the alt-right, the old racist right, Breitbart, the Tea Party, the Koch network, and the John Birch Society jumped on the Trump train. I recognized the paranoia, the hate, the fear that fueled the John Birch Society and my parents. The longer the campaign dragged on, the more uneasy I became. I shared my fears. Friends told me I was overreacting. They insisted that right-wing radicals could never take power, and that Trump was too stupid, too silly, too ridiculous to win. Plus, of course, millions of Republicans would never vote for the man. As election results rolled in, my phone started ringing. What the is happening? How did you know this was coming? Several people were angry that I hadn't done enough to sound the alarm. I wanted to scream. I've spent years telling my story of growing up in America's radical right. I outlined how today's GOP had adopted the ideas of the John Birch Society preached in the early 60s. I wrote a book about my life, Wrapped in the Flag, Beacon Press, 2013, and spent thousands of my own dollars traveling across the country, sharing my personal experiences. I did hundreds of radio interviews. I posted blogs, wrote tweets, made videos, contacted every person I could think of. No matter, I never landed an interview with Tom Hartman. Rachel never called. The PR person at Beacon could never get a response from anyone. I was told the John Birch Society was a footnote in history. People laughed at the idea that they'd ever have any real impact on our government. As you can imagine, my book was never a big seller. After Trump's election, I was sure people would be more interested. After all, most liberals have no idea how the radical right thinks and what they want. I had a unique position. I was witness to the thoughts and plans of the most extreme right-wingers. I contacted my publisher about writing another book, digging into the conspiracy theories, anarchist ideas, and religious extremism that drives the radical right and the Republican Party. I was told, I kid you not, that there was no interest in such a book. The reason, in their own words, was, quote, "The thing you warned about has come to pass, and the extreme right nature of the Republican Party, and especially this administration, is now on full display," unquote. Really? So liberals don't need to understand how we got here and what to do now? Even today, Americans and the liberal establishment keep telling themselves that Trump won't do what he said he'll do. Somehow the mantle of power will force him to be more presidential. The Republican Party will temper his tantrums and his bullying. He'll learn to respect our friends, like Mexico, and stand up to our enemies, like Putin. Trump will respect the rule of law and defend the civil rights of all Americans. The leaderships of the Democratic Party, including President Obama, Hillary Clinton, and the rest, rationalized that Trump was a fairly elected president. He deserved to be treated with the same respect as any other president. The Obama administration did everything possible to make the transition seamless. All of this was to protect and defend our democratic institutions and the peaceful transfer of power. And of course, we all have to give him a chance. In the Senate, our progressive leaders are voting for cabinet nominees who are unqualified. I'm talking to you, Elizabeth Warren and Sherrod Brown. Ben Carson is not prepared, but you are going to vote for him anyway. Where's the opposition to a cabinet of wealthy plutocrats, military hawks, and radicals who want to destroy the agencies they're going to head? The Democrats are caving before the battles are engaged. They've forgotten that the GOP won its majorities because it spent 8 years saying no, no, absolutely no to President Obama. Rather than fight, the Democrats have decided to find ways to work with Trump. What are these people talking about? When a radical right-wing president embraces authoritarian ideas, there is no place to work with the man. Who can find common ground with a president who opens an investigation into fictional voter fraud? Wake up, Democrats. Trump's planning to expand the extensive voter suppression already happening. When Trump talks about torture as a way to gather information, he's not confused, and he's not kidding. He's building support for waterboarding and hanging people on hooks and stripping prisoners naked and threatening them with dogs. When he signs orders that would allow him to pick up people who haven't committed a crime and to suggest he'd send the army to Chicago, he's not far from fascism. And Democrats are going to work with this man? How? How could they? Too many Americans still don't understand what radicals want and how they think. It's time we get this confusion cleared up right now. Radicals say what they mean, and they mean what they say. They are not kidding. They are not faking it. They are not speaking to a base. They are telling everyone what they plan. Take America Back is not just a slogan. The radical right has a destination in mind somewhere in the good old days around 1900, before the federal government had been infiltrated with progressive liberal ideas. The radical right believes America was created for people like them, primarily white males who've got money. Everything was just dandy until a conspiracy of liberals, atheists, and globalists gained power. Those liberals and socialist do-gooders pals passed unconstitutional laws, built labor protections, created a social safety net, and expanded civil rights. That kind of government could not be allowed. The radical right has been plotting, planning, organizing, and propagandizing for decades with one goal in mind: to rip progressive government out at the root. They know how to do this. Keep Americans by telling them that government is bad, expensive, useless. Point fingers at undeserving poor people who are stealing money from real Americans. Explode the deficit. Reagan and Bush, for example, while promising to fight out of control liberal spending, start wars, expand the military, push money to domestic surveillance, cut taxes for the rich, cut regulation, paint welfare, foreign aid, immigrants, and the rest as the causes of our problems, preach the need to balance the budget in order to prevent looming economic collapse, propose and pass drastic spending cuts that cripple and eventually kill programs that help the poor. Tell Americans that these cuts are the only way to save Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, food stamps, unemployment compensation in public schools. Attack anyone who fights back as un-American, lazy, a liberal scumbag. Insult, gag the media, restrict voting. These steps, they worked. They worked so perfectly that Donald Trump is the President of the United States. Now we have to step up and stop him. This will not happen unless we start facing facts. Trump is as bad as anyone could be, and he's worse than anyone thinks. It's time to stop pretending that Trump's presidency will crumble and the radical right will be run out of D.C. It's time to stop imagining some moderate Republicans will break with their party. The GOP will bow down before Trump, even while they laugh at him behind closed doors. They will confirm all of his nominees and pass his agenda for a simple reason. Donald Trump's agenda is the GOP agenda. He is doing the dirty work for them. Donald Trump's power comes from the GOP's power. They control 35 states, the House, the Senate, the executive branch. In a few months, unless Democrats fight a pitched battle and win it, they will cement control of the Supreme Court for decades. Decades. If we want to change the situation, we have to push our Democrats in the Senate and House to say no to every Trump appointment, every Trump nominee, and every Trump initiative. Until the Democrats discover a backbone, we will continue to bleed support and lose elections. Until the Democrats drop courtesy, learn to fight, we will live in the minority for a long time. Until the Democrats follow the example of women who marched in Washington, America will be Trump's America. Trump and his henchmen are coming for every bedrock principle American democracy ever had. When they are finished slashing and burning, we will not recognize our country. We are in hard times. Thank you very, very much, friend Claire Connor. I want people to go out and get her book, Wrapped in the Flag. She comes at this, you see, people, from a perspective which isn't just bandied about or advertised as unique. It is unique. Do you know anyone who grew up and then broke away from the radical far right in America? No, you do not. I didn't grow up with that either. I told you last week, people, that the far right in America have been waiting from the time that the America First Committee had to disband 4 days after Pearl Harbor because luck just wasn't with them on 7 December 1941. They've been waiting for a Steve Bannon to puppeteer a willing puppet such as Donald Trump for 3 and more generations. And they're there, and they're here, and it is now. Now, I want to tell you about this. I don't know if you're aware of the People's Calendar. It's a resistance tool, and you will need to Google it, the People's Calendar. Here are some examples of what it offers, the actions that it lets you be aware of, what it promotes. Now, you may search for congressional town halls, protest rallies, other events in your area. You sign up to get email alerts when your member of Congress hosts town halls and when other events take place in your community. We are all volunteers at the People's Calendar who believe information about town halls and other events should be available to any and all American citizens. We are just getting started and still developing, so please submit events you know about or join us as a volunteer and pull information together. Contact the People's Calendar. Sign up. I can tell you that the events are legion. They go from Virginia, North Carolina, Baltimore, Maryland, Newport Richey, Florida, Frederick, Maryland, Oak Park, Illinois, all kinds of events. Kent, Washington, Atlanta, Georgia, Alexandria, Virginia, Wethersfield, Connecticut, Bellingham, Washington, here in D.C., Denver, Colorado, all different kinds of events you see. Go to the People's Calendar. Calendar something yourself by joining, or just read what's in your area. Go Google the People's Calendar now. Now, from Politico, inside the protest movement that, quite frankly, has Republicans reeling, and this piece comes from writers Ilana Shore and Rachel Bade. Hill Republicans are openly accusing liberal mega donors of bankrolling the tide of local protesters storming their offices. They're beefing up their physical protection from demonstrators, and they're employing out-of-state critics to stop clogging their phone lines. It's just yelling and criticizing. There's no substance, says Dave Bratt, Republican of Virginia. It's a protest against the elections, to which Angela Padilla, a co-founder of the group organizing the demonstrations that have spread across the country in a matter of weeks, well, said this: "You'd better get used to it. We want to pressure these members of Congress for as long as we have this president." Dubbed the Invisible, the group launched as a way for Padilla and a handful of fellow ex-Democratic aides to channel their post-election heartbreak into a manual for quashing Donald Trump's agenda. They drafted a 26-page protest guide. Look that up. You can see this guide called invisibleguide.com. Go to www.invisibleguide.com. It includes a stirring promise to fellow Trump enemies. Good luck, we will win. The group isn't planning to limit itself to town hall resistance to repealing Obamacare. That's it becoming known for. Indivisible has marshaled demonstrations against Trump's cabinet nominees and his immigration order, and it's partnering with the organizers of the January 21 Women's March for a new action. Its handful of senior leaders count about 100 contributors to their national organizing work, but insist that all work is on a volunteer basis. The group began when Ezra Levin, a former aide to Texas Democratic Representative Lloyd Doggett, commiserated over the election in late November with his wife, Leah Greenberg, a longtime aide to Virginia Democratic Republican Tom Perriello. They got to work on what became the Indivisible Guide. The Indivisible Guide, billed as a set of best practices for making Congress listen. The Indivisible Guide borrows openly from the early tactics of what? Oh, here's irony. From the Tea Party, which sprouted on the strength of local conservative resistance to former President Barack Obama's hefty government stimulus bill and health care reform plan. Trump is not popular, says the guide. He does not have a mandate. He does not have large congressional majorities. If a small minority in the Tea Party could stop President Obama on a number of agenda points, then we, the majority, can stop a petty tyrant. The indivisible manual is often blunt about what it says members of Congress really tick, what makes them tick, and how protesters might use it to their advantage. One chart compares what your member of Congress cares a lot about, for example, an interest group's endorsement versus what a lawmaker doesn't care about. One, for example, your thoughtful analysis on the proposed bill. While the million-strong turnout for anti-Trump women's marchers captured the nation last month, the indivisible founders were conscious of the need to protest tactics that could truly force members of Congress to pay attention or risk losing their seats. Marches are great to bring people together, but our experience, they say, tells us that Congress needs to be channeled in a smart way to make a difference on the Hill. Indivisibles founders never planned or expected the groundswell of interest that resulted from their guide, which prompted them to organize a 501c4 group this month. Indivisible's guide has spread at the grassroots level at an unpredictable speed this year. Less than 2 months after the group launched its website, 225,000 interested participants have registered to learn more. Fast forward to last weekend. Police escorted Representative Tom McClintock, Republican of California, out of his own town hall meeting after a local Indivisible chapter joined other progressive groups to protest it. When the Tea Party began rattling lawmakers with local disruptions, well, how did we react? Now we can do similar things. People, I want you to look up indivisibleguide.com, www.indivisibleguide.com. Now, dig this short piece. It's from the Netherlands. The Netherlands has decided to counter Donald Trump with an international abortion fund. The Dutch government is leading the charge to counter the impact of America's plan, Donald Trump's plan, to halt foreign aid to any organization which support abortion in any way. This is reported by writer Ben Windsor. The Dutch government's planning to launch an international fund to finance access to birth control and abortion in developing countries in order to fill the gap left after the Trump administration announced it would no longer fund any overseas aid organizations which even discussed abortion. Banning abortions does not result in fewer abortions, according to the Dutch Trade and Development Minister Liliane Ploumen. It leads to more irresponsible practices in back rooms and more maternal deaths. The World Health Organization estimates that 22 million women every year experience unsafe abortions, the vast majority of whom are in developing nations. A 2008 report from the organization estimated that nearly 50,000 women die from complications in such procedures annually. Minister Ploumen said the Trump administration's decision risked undermining recent advances in women's health. We must not allow that to happen, she said. We need to compensate for this financial blow as much as we can with a broad-based fund which governments, business, and civil society organizations Well, they can donate to it so that women can remain in control of their own bodies. The minister said her intention was to counter the impact of the funding ban on women and girls around the world. Asked whether the Australian government would contribute to such a fund, a spokesperson for Foreign Minister Julie Bishop said that the government was committed to the protection and promotion of sexual and reproduction health rights, access to sexual and reproductive health, particularly family planning, remains critical to women's empowerment, improving gender equality, and reducing maternal and child mortality. Known as the global gag rule, the funding ban was first instituted under the Reagan White House back when, in 1984. The ban applies to any organization which provides abortion services, information, even information or counseling on referrals, even if those programs are funded by other donors. President Bill Clinton rescinded that gag rule in '93. President Bush reinstated it in '01, and Obama lifted it again. President Obama lifted it again in '09. Good on you, Netherlands. You know, last week a fellow writer shared a piece favorably comparing Mr. Trump to Mr. Manson. It's inapt. Mr. Manson has a measure of self-control. And let me remind you yet again, the simplest, most damnable error good people make in the face of fascists' blunt promises is to analyze those promises a cover for not wanting to believe those promises, a wishing away, enabling those promises' horrid immediate, midterm, long-term effects, embedding them in the culture, easing fascism's grasp, encouraging its gluttony. Do any of you think, Mr. Bannon and Mr. Trump, those kinds of people, do any of you believe that they are models of patience? No, they have waited since the abandonment of the America First movement on 11 December 1941. Oh, do they hate the Japanese for forcing that? 11 December 1941. Do not encourage people fascism's grasp. Do not encourage fascism's gluttony. Do not. We have an enormous job to do. It is enormous. So all of you, send me your stories, poems, essays. Send them to me, jwolf41387. Keep trying to live as if justice matters, as if what you do, it matters. Be creative, courageous. Take your place on that great Mandela, next to Bud Clayman and every one of our writers, next to me. This is our brief moment of time. Repair this crazy place. Yes, you can do it. We've got to do it, as Phil Oakes said, while we're here. And I remind you, join us next week. You may hear all of our programming where www.oursalon.ning.com/new episodes. And yes, God bless our newborn Reich. And always remember, here and everywhere, we will win. We will win over this newborn Reich because it's passionate justice.